So you guys, most of you probably know about that memory function on Facebook, right? I can see some hands. All right, if it doesn't ring a bell, it's all right. It's that thing where every once in a while the social networking algorithm that runs our lives decides that you want to see an old picture or post that you put up on Facebook years ago, but on the same day. And at one point this week, the specific memory that came up on Facebook for me was a picture from about 7 years ago of some of our kids participating in the Epiphany pageant. Some of you may recall that pageant, actually. Back then, we had to cancel it twice during Advent because of weather. It was the opposite sort of winter from the one so far that we've had. So, in order not to disappoint the kids that year, or ourselves, were we to be honest, we had the pageant on the second Sunday after Christmas, Epiphany Sunday, which this year is today. And in fact, I know that some of my colleagues in Maine are settling for the Epiphany pageant even as we speak. Now, in my memory, my actual memory, even though we didn't change the script at all from what we had planned for Advent, in my memory, I've always seen that year's production, and yes, I can tell them apart. I remember that year's production less because of Mary and Joseph and the baby, and more because of the stories of the shepherds and the Magi marching down the center aisle here, wearing their fake mustaches, because everyone wore fake mustaches that year, to gather the animals or to hand out the presents. And no doubt this memory, this change in perspective, has to do with the fairly obvious change in time and context. That year, the pageant wasn't being held, as per usual, at the beginning of the holiday, but instead at the end. Epiphany is, in fact, the Magi's day, and just like they do at the end of their story, we too are moving on. So the idea of normal, run-of-the-mill folks on their various journeys to and from Bethlehem probably has more currency for us on this Sunday, after the close and holy darkness of Christmas Eve, after the rush of parties and visiting that happens, and after the start of the new year, than it would have back in December. This is the time in the church when we become curious about how people approach the next chapter of the gospel story, and how they approach the question of what the next chapter means for those of us trying to live our lives in just and spiritual ways. Now, on the face of it, the Magi story doesn't actually give us much of a hint, does it? At least that's the case if we focus on their relationship, their brief relationship with Jesus. There is that story, that part of the story about the highly symbolic and unlikely gifts. But really, that's not much to go on. Jesus is a baby and largely non-responsive in the Christmas story. So the stories of the shepherds and the Magi, even when we concentrate on them, don't really give us a whole lot of practical advice for connecting to the God out there in any systematic or theological sense. But fortunately for us at least, maybe not for the Magi themselves, the Magi do meet someone else on their travels, and their relationship with that guy starts and finishes our Matthew reading. This year, as with that pageant on this Sunday 7 years ago, the context has shifted. The world we live in is changing once again, and the pageant that we witnessed on Sunday, the Sunday before Christmas, had a new script. And that script featured an appearance from someone we haven't heard much from in recent pageants. I'm not talking about Santa Claus. Instead, and maybe it's obvious at this point, but instead I mean King Herod. In Matthew, the Magi's response to him may not tell us much about how to deal with the divine or the heavenly host of angels, but it tells us a lot about how we should relate to the human society that we inhabit. In the beginning of our reading, the Magi meet Herod, who's a stand-in, really. Herod is a stand-in for worldly power and control. He's a wealthy person, he's a ruler, he is beholden to an even greater secular and religious power in the form of the Roman emperor. He's an enforcer. He's a force in the establishment, and the Roman Empire is an establishment to be reckoned with. And this Herod, as he's probably requested thousands of times, in our story, this Herod requests a report on the new threat, the new challenge to the authority that he represents. And he sends the Magi off fully expecting that report will be on his desk upon their inevitable return. But we know that that's not how the story goes. It turns out that the Magi choose not to make that report. Instead, our pageant has them sort of drift down the side aisle by the door after deciding to go home by another road. And that choice they make is a key and important choice. It's something more than a society snub. In fact, the whole of Matthew turns on that moment because, remember, in spite of the song that we love so much, they are not kings. So when they answer the call toward a road less traveled and reject the call of Herod, they have chosen the path of resistance. They have chosen to resist, which is essential for what comes after. Let's think about that for a minute. What if the Magi, in fact, went back to submit that report to Herod? Presumably the gospel, at least the gospel of Matthew, would have nothing more to say. There'd be no Jesus. There'd be no prophetic teachings. There'd be no revolution of hearts and minds. Instead, there'd just be a few more deaths in a time when a few deaths tended to go unnoticed. The results would be things as they have always been. Herod would have seen to that. Now, it may seem strange, given the story today, but somehow, in spite of its radical beginnings, for most of the history of the Big C Church, most people have maintained the rather unbiblical notion that the proper place for institutions like ours is with Herod and not against him. And it has probably been the accepted view since the days of Emperor Constantine. That is a long time ago. Now, of course, there's always been exceptions, right? I mean, I say that and I say, well, what about St. Francis of Assisi? What about the Pilgrims and the Puritans that formed the bedrock of Congregationalism, a tradition of dissent that we, of course, spring from? What about Martin Luther King or Howard Thurman? Or today, what about Reverend William Barber? They continue that tradition of dissent. But the notion that the dissenters are considered exceptional, the fact that we could make a list of them is telling. It is telling in the face of Gospels that start by placing the poor child of an unwed teen mom on the same level as the ruler of the land, underscoring the fact To borrow the words of John Marshall Harlan, the fact that the humblest is the peer of the most powerful. If we are to be serious about our faith, whatever that faith may be, this idea, one of equality and openness between and among our fellow earthly inhabitants, is the foundation upon which to build. Because it requires not just a tolerance of others, but a stance of radical welcome, a willingness to celebrate what makes us different, as much as we celebrate what we hold in common. Now, earlier I said that our context is changing once again. And sometimes to pay attention to current events in 2017 is to grapple with deep and often unpleasant emotions. The Herods of this world, and there are plenty, the Herods want us to be afraid. They want us to be afraid of each other because we are more easily manipulated through fear. They want us to take up sides. They want us to join teams, to draw circles around ourselves to the exclusion of others, to adhere to our symbols from religious icons to national and secular ones. They want to make us feel as though our culture and our lives are threatened by forces beyond our control. They want us to be led down that dark road of division. But we must choose a different road. We must go home by another way. Now in our great hymnal, which we haven't been using much during Advent, but in our great hymnal published by one of the denominations we represent, you will find the words that remind us that in this church we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You can find that right before the first hymn in most of your great hymns. That's something that should be obvious and commonplace in all of our society. And yet at times, it seems to be an extreme statement. But it's a statement that we must make. Sometimes we must appear extreme. So today, as we stand once again at the edge of another year and at the end of another Christmas, let us recommit ourselves to the journey of the Magi. A journey of exploration, of study, of service, and of dissent.